They called it Project Mirror Twins in the file, but the first line under the title is the one that stays with me. Preliminary objective: to make two bodies disagree about time. That was the sentence I read twice before I even realized I'd stopped breathing. The idea that the USSR tried to study bodies aging at different speeds would be absurd if it wasn't sitting here in front of me, stamped, numbered, and half burned at the edges. I didn't get this folder through official channels. It arrived in the gray way so many things did. A courier who didn't leave his name, a sealed archive envelope that clearly wasn't sealed in any official building, and a short note: "You like impossible stories. Try this one." No signature, no return address, just a handwriting I didn't recognize and a smell of old paper that didn't match the envelope at all. The cover wasn't dramatic. No red stamps, no warning triangles, just plain paper with an overused file number, and the code name written in a hurried pencil that broke halfway through the word mirror. Someone had tried to erase the original description and write a new one on top. Under certain light, I could still make out the first version. Observation of artificial twins, biological. Someone had scratched out artificial with enough force to leave a dent. Inside, the first thing that caught my eye was not the protocols or the diagrams. It was a photograph, slid between the pages without any protective sleeve. 2 metal examination tables. 2 small shapes lying on white sheets. Identical, at least at a glance. Not like mirror copies in a photograph, more like the same object captured twice from a slightly different moment. The lighting was harsh, clinical. In the top corner of the frame, a technician's hand reached in, adjusting one of the monitors just outside the crop. I stayed with that hand longer than with the supposed twins. The fingers looked tense, like whoever was standing behind the camera did not want this shot taken. The summary sheet said the lab was in a provincial research complex, officially listed as a biomedical institute. The documents never used the local city name. They only called it the facility. According to the first entries, the place wasn't supposed to handle anything beyond routine pharmacological studies and telemetry. Then, sometime in the early 70s, someone higher up redirected a new stream of material to them, together with 2 security officers and an unmarked crate. Within a few months, mirror twins appeared in the internal register. What makes these files interesting isn't just what they say, it's how they're arranged. The story isn't told straight, it's scattered between routine lab logs, incident notes, security memoranda, and a handful of photographs that don't always match the dates. Someone tried to dismantle the narrative, page by page, and still missed enough for a patient reader to reconstruct it. Or maybe they weren't trying to hide it from people like me. Maybe they were trying to hide it from themselves. The first mention of the main subject is brief. 2 organisms received identical baseline parameters within permissible deviation. No label, no origin note. They are described in absolutely dry language, which somehow makes certain details worse. Weight within a fraction of a gram. Length exactly the same. Heart rate, blood composition, even minor scars duplicated. There's a line about their behavior that makes me pause. Subject pair reacts to stimulus in nearly synchronous fashion, but with slight latency in one of them, which inverts depending on the type of stimulus. It's written as if this is just another measurable variable. No one, at least on paper, seems surprised. The scientists never call them people. They never even call them animals. They become the pair, the twin set, the organisms. The language twists and sidesteps around anything that might imply consciousness. Still, in the margins of one early report, I can see a different hand, probably a technician's, scribbling. They look at each other. That line is crossed out, but not effectively enough. According to the notes, the first phase of the experiment was supposed to be simple. Monitor the pair under identical conditions, track how they respond to a controlled environment, and see whether small differences emerge over time. Aging is slow. Bureaucracy is slower. For the first few weeks, mirror twins could have passed as another long, dull study, funded by a ministry already losing interest in what it had signed. Then, at some point, the monitoring board started showing something no one had asked to see. The technicians recorded the anomaly first. Not the scientists, not security. A junior lab technician, bored during a night shift, noticed that two separate monitoring channels showed a faint echo. These were not supposed to be connected. Each twin had its own set of sensors, its own line on the graph. Yet, in the faint noise between peaks, in the background the analysts usually filtered out, a subtle pattern started to form. The description of that moment is short, but there's a dry fear between the lines. Baseline drift present on both channels, with synchronized fluctuations not explained by shared environment. That's the official phrasing. In the technician's personal log, which only survived because it was misfiled, the same moment becomes, "It looked like the traces were holding a conversation behind the measurements we were supposed to care about." That conversation took form over a series of nights. The twins would be resting, sedated, or simply asleep, and their physiological graphs would begin to show tiny hesitations and accelerations. When one line dipped, the other followed a heartbeat later. When one rose, its pair mirrored the ascent, but with a subtle delay, like a reflection in disturbed water. Then, without warning, the roles would switch. The second twin would lead, the first would echo. None of it fit the neat columns in the protocols. There's a paragraph where the supervising scientist tries to impose sense on it. He writes about the possibility of the monitoring equipment picking up ambient interference, subtle vibrations from the building, crosstalk from other labs. The cables are replaced. Filters are recalibrated. The anomaly persists. One day, there's a concise note. Signal found linking responses of the pair. No physical connector. Correlation persists when subjects moved to different rooms. That should have been the point where the project shut down or expanded into something openly ambitious. Instead, something more subtle happened. The KGB officer assigned to the lab started attending every nightly observation. His name isn't listed, just the title representative. I imagine a man in a dark suit that never quite fits the setting, sitting in a corner of the observation room, saying little. There's a short memo from the lab director complaining about the suffocating presence of security in routine scientific work. The complaint has a second, scribbled note added diagonally across it. Representative attendance mandatory for sessions involving parallel monitoring. That's how mirror twins moved from a questionable research program to something else. The security reports start using a different vocabulary. Strategic interest, a special potential, possible application in personnel selection and longevity studies. The scientists write about aging curves, stress markers, tiny changes in bone density. The security officer writes about coordinated endurance and relative preservation across pair. They may have been in the same room, but they weren't watching the same thing. The first time the file mentions aging directly is months into the project. Subject A shows marginal acceleration of degenerative markers relative to Subject B. It could be nothing. Bodies diverge. Still, someone circles the line and writes "monitor," underlined twice. Over the following weeks, the notes accumulate small differences with unsettling regularity. Subject A develops slightly more gray in its hair. Subject B's reflexes test a fraction of a second faster. Subject A's skin shows minor dryness while Subject B's remains almost unchanged. Tiny details, easy to dismiss individually. Taken together, they start to form a slope. What makes this slope strange is that it isn't stable. Sometimes Subject A seems older, then the difference shrinks. Sometimes Subject B appears to catch up, then falls behind again. Then there's the detail I keep returning to. The technicians repeatedly mention that when one twin looks tired, the other appears almost energized, as if strength is being redistributed according to rules nobody wrote. At some point, the scientists start introducing controlled stress. That is the part of the file that is hardest to read, even though the language remains neutral and exact. They reduce the temperature in one room while keeping the other stable. They alternate light cycles. They impose changes in diet. Every time they push one twin in a certain direction, the other reacts as if some portion of the strain has been quietly carried over the invisible line between them. The technician's notes grow more personal. One writes that after a series of cold exposure sessions, Subject A's hands took on a permanent faint tremor, while Subject B's remained steady. Another remarks that Subject B began showing an odd habit. During rest periods, it would flex its fingers in slow, precise movements, as if practicing an action it had never performed. These remarks are underlined and followed by curt comments from the department head. Irrelevant. Do not anthropomorphize. Refrain from subjective adjectives. The more they try to strip away perspective, the more it leaks into the margins. When they begin deliberately manipulating time in the lives of the twins, the language in the files becomes almost apologetic. There's a note about controlled divergence of circadian pattern. In plain words, they started giving one twin longer days and shorter nights, while restricting the other to an artificially compressed cycle. The aim, as stated in the protocol, was to evaluate whether subjective time load influences aging markers in a mirrored organism set. It would have been ambitious even without the anomaly. With the signal between them, it becomes something else entirely. The results build slowly. Subject A, with elongated days, begins to show signs of fatigue earlier in the week. Subject B, with compressed cycles, displays intermittent restlessness, but better performance in certain tasks. The anomaly on the monitoring board strengthens. The technicians note that sometimes, when Subject A falls asleep mid-shift, Subject B jolts awake without apparent reason, then settles as soon as A's breathing evens out. Graphs show a delayed echo of one body's rhythms in the others. There are no witnesses listed for the first major incident, just a bare description. During simultaneous observation, Subject A's respiratory pattern abruptly destabilized, while Subject B remained stable. Within approximately 1 minute, Subject A's appearance altered, as if experiencing accelerated fatigue. Subject B showed transient improvement in peripheral circulation and skin tone. The phrases are careful, but the implication is simple. One body looked suddenly older, the other looked for a moment younger. It was the technicians who reacted like human beings, The report notes that monitoring was interrupted when staff left assigned positions contrary to protocol to check the twin directly. Subject A's skin had taken on a sallow tone more typical of someone years older. Small lines around the eyes deepened. In the following hours, blood work revealed an abrupt increase in markers associated with stress and wear. Subject B, meanwhile, showed unexpectedly robust results. The anomaly traced between their graphs that night was described as dense, a word that doesn't belong in scientific measurement but appears nonetheless. After that, the KGB representative is no longer a silent attendant. His observations start appearing in the margins, written in a distinct, blocky hand. Potential transfer mechanism, he writes next to the description of the incident. Consider directed application. Where the scientists talk about runaway variables and ethical boundaries they are in no position to define, the representative writes about selective extension and asset preservation. Mirror Twins stops being an oddity and starts being a potential tool. The project shifts focus. Instead of merely observing how the twins respond to parallel conditions, they begin trying to push one body forward and hold the other back to see how far the divergence can be stretched. They design regimes where Subject A carries heavier workloads, harsher environmental changes, more invasive procedures, while Subject B is kept comparatively protected. It is as if they are trying to load the aging of two lives onto one organism. What surprises them, and what clearly unsettles the head scientist, is that the difference is never permanent. Yes, Subject A ages faster during these intense periods, showing rapid accumulation of small signs, microfractures healing slower, reaction times dipping, minor cardiac irregularities. But then, once the stress is reduced, there are intervals where A's condition stabilizes while B, the supposedly favored twin, shows a subtle but noticeable downturn. The slope of aging seems to slide back and forth between them, like water in a shared hidden reservoir. Somewhere in this period, the file records the arrival of a new consultant. No name, just a title, Special Medical Advisor. His notes are precise, more reflective, occasionally even philosophical. He writes, "We are not simply observing two bodies. We are observing a conversation between moments." The line is underlined in red by someone else, with the word unacceptable scrawled next to it. Yet his observations slip into the protocols. Suggestions to test memory retention, to introduce minor identity markers into their routines, to see whether subjective experience can be made to lag behind or jump ahead of physical aging. There's a cruel little experiment buried among the pages, one the lab clearly did not want outside eyes to dwell on. They give one twin a daily ritual, a simple sequence of gestures before sleep, performed at the same time, at the same place. They teach it over days, reinforcing it, rewarding compliance. The other twin receives no such pattern. Yet after a few weeks, technicians note that the untrained twin starts imitating fragments of the ritual during rest periods, particularly when its counterpart is not in sight. The notes don't say whether anyone considered the possibility that the twins experienced their days in an order that didn't match the clock on the wall. The culmination comes, as it often does in these files, not with a grand breakthrough but with a cascade of minor errors. There's a power fluctuation in the facility one autumn week. A generator test goes wrong. Lights flicker. Some monitoring equipment needs recalibration. The technicians improvise, bridging cables, rerouting signals between rooms. For a brief window, the monitoring boards show both twins' readings on the same physical display, their traces overlaying each other in real time. In the chaos of the test, one of the junior technicians begins a routine stress protocol on Subject A, assuming the KGB representative has given the go-ahead. The authorization was never actually signed, as later notes will carefully emphasize. Subject A is hooked to a series of mild but building stressors. Changes in temperature, sound, light. Subject B is left in stable, controlled conditions, intended as the resting copy to provide baseline. What happens next is described in a series of overlapping reports that never entirely agree on the sequence. The technicians claim that on the shared monitoring display, the traces of both twins began to pull apart in a way no one had seen before. Subject A's lines grew jagged, frantic. Subject B's lines flattened, their amplitude shrinking as if certain peaks and valleys were being quietly shaved off and pasted onto the other chart. The security report insists that this is a misinterpretation, that the readings merely reflected standard stress responses. Yet, the description of the twins themselves that day tells a different story. Multiple witnesses write that Subject A's physical appearance shifted within hours to something shockingly aged. Not in the grotesque cinematic sense. No sudden whitening of hair, no dramatic collapse. Instead, a subtle but undeniable settling of features, a heaviness in the eyelids, a stiffness in the joints that made every movement look like it belonged to someone at least a decade older. Subject B, seen in the adjacent room, looked strangely light. Not younger, exactly, but as if some invisible weight had been lifted from its muscles and lungs. The KGB representative's notes about that day are sparse. One line only. Observed potential for load redistribution under unplanned merged monitoring. Repeat under controlled conditions. It reads like a man who has finally seen proof of something he suspected, and now wants to turn it into a lever. The scientists resist. The head of the lab writes a formal objection, invoking ethical considerations rarely acknowledged in such files. He argues that any further attempt to force divergence between the twins risks irreversible psychological and physiological damage, threatens the validity of the research, and may produce effects not contained to the subjects. That last phrase is heavily underlined later, with "specify" scribbled angrily next to it. The reply from above is simple. Objection noted. Proceed according to revised protocol. From this point, the file becomes jumpy. Pages are missing, entire sections replaced by short summaries in a different typeface, clearly added later. Several experiment descriptions end in mid-sentence, as if someone removed the rest of the page with a razor. What survives suggests that they attempted at least 3 more redistribution events, deliberately creating conditions in which one twin would bear an amplified version of life's wear, while the other would float at a slightly slower rate. Each time, the initial divergence is impressive. Each time, it proves unstable. The twins' aging curves don't simply separate and stay apart. They bend, twist, and seek each other, like 2 branches tied together under competing weights. When Subject A is pushed closer to a ledge, Subject B leans away, but not freely. When the force is lifted, the strain echoes back. Time, whatever that word means in the context of these 2 bodies, refuses to remain unevenly distributed for long. And then there's the observation that may have sealed the project's fate. During one redistribution attempt, a technician notes that a third graph on the monitoring board showed a small, unexplained fluctuation. This third channel wasn't connected to either twin patient. It was a control line, meant to demonstrate the absence of interference. The fluctuation matched a tiny hesitation in subject B's heartbeat, down to the faint late echo that had become the anomaly's signature. The technician shrugged it off at the time, chalked it up to instrument noise. In a later memo, written after the project's suspension, he admits he wonders if for a moment the conversation between the twins reached past their confined system. The incident that officially ends Mirror Twins is described with infuriating neatness. On date removed, during scheduled evaluation, Subject A suffered acute systemic failure. Resuscitation measures were unsuccessful. There are no further details in the main report. No mention of how the technicians had started calling Subject A the holder, or how some of them had begun to speak of Subject B as the one that walks away. Those nicknames survive only in the fragments of personal notebooks. The annexes paint a slightly different picture. On that final day, the twins were not under experimental stress conditions, at least not formally. The lab had supposedly reduced all interventions to routine monitoring. Yet one nurse notes that Subject A appeared unusually drained upon waking, complaining of a heavy night, while Subject B spoke, yes, by this point the file admits they spoke, in oddly detached terms about a dream in which it stood beside a train platform, watching someone else leave. In the hours before Subject A's collapse, the monitoring board showed a slow, almost graceful convergence in their graphs. For once, A and B's lines lay almost on top of each other, the anomaly trace fading into the background. It's as if, for a brief time, they really were mirror images again. Then Subject A's line faltered. A dip, a plateau, a flat line. Subject B's line, instead of collapsing in sympathy, flared. Heart rate accelerated, then stabilized at a healthier rhythm than it had shown in weeks. Skin tone improved. Blood pressure settled into an almost textbook norm. Subject A's body aged in those final minutes, according to the doctor's description, as if years had been compressed into an hour. Subject B, left standing in the doorway as the team worked, looked not shocked, but strangely emptied, like someone waking from an exhausting argument and realizing they still have to go to work. The KGB representative's note on this event is a single sentence again. Asset consolidation appears to have occurred. No one corrects his choice of words. What happens to the surviving twin is murky. The main file ends with a line claiming that Subject B was transferred to another facility for continued observation under special regime. No location, no code. Other documents in the bundle hint that such a transfer may never have happened. There's a requisition form for transportation that was never stamped. There's an inventory list for the lab's final days that does not mention a living subject. Only biological remains and equipment to be decommissioned. And there is a handwritten note tucked between pages like an accidental bookmark with no name or date. It reads, "If someone leaves while you are still carrying their time, which one of you is older?" The cover-up phase is clumsy in some places, meticulous in others. Official evaluations declare the project scientifically promising but functionally inconclusive. Its methods insufficiently reliable for strategic use. The ethical objections raised by the lab's director are retroactively reframed as concerns about data integrity. The scientists are reassigned or quietly sidelined. The head of the project is said to have accepted a teaching position somewhere far from any serious research institute. The technicians' fates are mostly unrecorded, though one of them leaves a trace in a different archive. A letter to a relative, never sent, found among his effects after a car accident years later. In it, he writes that for months after leaving the lab, he kept waking up with the sensation that his reflection in the bathroom mirror was half a second out of sync. There is no grand bonfire, no cinematic destruction of all evidence. Mirror Twins is smothered more slowly. Files are split and filed under different headings. Annexes are lost in transit. Photographs are misclassified as routine clinical material. Some pieces, like the technician's misfiled notes or the consultant's philosophical margins, survive precisely because no one thought them important enough to hunt down. The result is a story that feels less like a conspiracy and more like a set of hands covering their own eyes. The final document in the folder is an unsigned evaluation, written in language that feels vaguely familiar, as if adapted from some internal handbook for impossible projects. It concludes that while Project Mirror Twins has not provided a practical method for controlled divergence in aging between paired organisms, it strongly suggests that biological time is not an entirely local phenomenon. The writer suggests that future work might pursue a model where time is understood as a distributed quantity across connected systems, not solely as an individual burden. The KGB margin note next to this is simple. Dangerous framing. Do not circulate. I don't know who wrote that evaluation. I don't know whether they believed what they were saying, or were simply trying to justify years of unnerving work. What I do know is that once you have read these pages, it becomes difficult to look at the most ordinary things in the same way. Identical twins passing in the street. Old couples who seem to trade ailments back and forth. The quiet exhaustion in the eyes of someone who has survived while a friend has not. The file ends, but the question it raises doesn't. If there really was a small, quiet Soviet lab trying to make two bodies age at different speeds, if those bodies really did seem to hand off wear and time between them like a shared suitcase, then the failure of the project may be the only good news in the story. They did not find a stable lever. They did not create a reliable way to load one life's cost onto another. Time, in the end, resisted being accounted for so neatly. Still, I can't help thinking about that unsent letter, about the man who couldn't quite trust his own reflection. It's a small note, easy to dismiss. But once you start reading archives like these, you begin to recognize the faint, recurring echo of the anomaly the technicians saw on their monitoring boards. Tiny hesitations, late reactions, lives that seem to move half a step away from where they should be. Maybe Mirror Twins never really ended. Maybe it just slipped out of its lab and into the quiet, unrecorded moments when one person walks away from an accident that should have claimed them both, or when siblings realize that one has somehow grown older in the space of a season while the other remains unchanged. There's no protocol for that. No graph, no anomaly trace, no box to tick in a report. There's only the feeling you get when you stand in front of a mirror after a long day, and for just a heartbeat, you are not entirely sure which of you had to pay for the other to walk away. I spent a few days trying to convince myself Mirror Twins was simply an elaborate misinterpretation. One of those cases where routine data is bent into a shape that looks meaningful only in hindsight. The problem is that the more I looked for mundane explanations, the more stray hints I found that someone had tried and failed to do exactly the same thing before me. In a separate bundle from a different year, there is a disciplinary note for a lab technician in another city, reprimanded for casual comparison of test subjects to previous confidential projects. The phrase he used, according to the charge, was, "They lean on each other like the twins." No one names the project, but I recognize the echo. This was years after Mirror Twins was supposedly closed. Officially, nothing like it was ever repeated. Unofficially, language has a way of carrying experiments further than their budgets. When you move through Cold War archives long enough, you start seeing the same anxious handwriting in different places. Not literally the same hand, of course, but the same tone. People who are not scared of weapons or politics, but of something smaller and stranger. A reading on a meter that refuses to settle. A patient who reports remembering events that do not line up with the schedule. In the margins of a later psychological assessment file, a doctor uses a phrase that made my skin crawl. Patient describes sensation of carrying years for someone else, though no referent is given. There's no mention of twins, no talk of synchronized graphs. But after Mirror Twins, it is hard not to read that as an echo. I went back to the physical description of the facility where Mirror Twins took place, such as it was. The file is vague on purpose. It calls the building mid-sized, on the edge of a forested zone, with access to adequate power and isolated transport. This could describe dozens of places. Still, one of the attached photographs meant to show equipment accidentally captured a narrow window with a particular pattern of frost at the edges of the glass and a line of pine trees beyond. I have seen those trees, or trees like them, in more than one other file. The head of the lab, according to his personnel file, had made his career on small, steady studies. Nothing like this. He had lived in a world where time was a stable axis, where aging followed predictable, depressing curves. His earlier publications talk about statistical regularity, about population-level trends. To go from that to watching two bodies tradeware like contraband must have eaten at him. In one memo, he writes, "We are no longer talking about extending life in general. We are talking about deciding who gets to age." The sentence is crossed out in the final version, replaced by something dull about allocation of biological resources in paired systems. But the original is still faintly visible beneath, like a half-erased confession. I keep trying to picture the surviving twin after the project ended. If Subject B was indeed transferred, it would have arrived in some other ward as an anonymous patient with an incomplete file. New doctors would see only a body that did not quite match its stated age, a set of lab results that alternated between remarkable resilience and sudden, inexplicable crashes. They might have labeled it a rare syndrome, written a paper, moved on. Or perhaps the transfer never happened, and Subject B's story ended in a cold basement room with fluorescent lights and a chalk mark on the wall. There is one more fragment that refuses to settle in my mind. In a separate medical log, kept by an anonymous hospital somewhere in the same region, and dated a few years after Mirror Twins, there is an admission report for an unidentified patient. No documents, confused speech, a body that appears older than the estimated age given in the report. The patient repeats only one phrase clearly when asked for personal details. The other one stopped walking. The staff chalk it up to trauma. The patient dies within months with organs that look, in the autopsy report, older than expected. Could it be connected? Probably not. The world is full of ambiguous sentences, but when you have read about a twin set where one stops so the other can walk away, it is difficult not to hear an echo. At some point, you have to decide whether to believe the internal logic of a file like this, or to treat it as a cautionary fable written by a system to scare itself. It is easier for everyone involved to call mirror twins a failure and move on. To say, the USSR studied bodies aging at different speeds, did not find a usable method, and buried the project. That version lets us keep time as an individual condition. Each of us grows old on our own schedule, for our own reasons, under our own skin. But after enough nights spent with these pages, another possibility nudges at the edge of thought. What if the real failure wasn't technical, but political? Not that they could not reliably shift aging between bodies, but that they realized what it would mean if they could. Every hierarchy assumes that cost and benefit can be arranged in a vertical stack. Someone up top endures less, someone at the bottom endures more. Mirror twins hints at something worse, that if time really can be treated like a load to be moved along invisible lines, then every relationship, every bond becomes suspect. Who is resting because someone else is carrying their weight? The people in these files never use that kind of language. They talk about asset consolidation and load redistribution, about longevity curves and paired organisms. Yet, every now and then, a phrase slips through that sounds dangerously like guilt. The consultant writes, "We must ask whether the preservation of one life at the measurable expense of another is not simply a medical question, but an existential one." The margin note from security next to it is short. Out of scope. Stick to procedure. As if procedure could fully contain what they were playing with. When I close the folder on mirror twins, I have the same faint sensation I've gotten with a few other projects that were never meant to be read as stories. It feels like standing in a hallway where two doors have just been shut at once behind you and ahead of you, and for a second you are in a space that belongs to neither room, only to the act of passing between them. The technician who thought the graphs were holding a conversation wasn't wrong. The conversation was about who had to step through first and who had to linger on the threshold. Archives are full of dead experiments, half-born ideas, and abandoned theories. Most of them are merely sad. Mirror twins is different because it leaves you with a suspicion that something succeeded just enough to leave a mark outside its walls. Not a miracle drug, not a weapon, not a miracle cure for aging. Just a thin, invisible habit of the world to balance certain books without consulting the people inside them. So when you hear about someone who walks away from a crash that crushed everyone else in the vehicle, or about a pair of siblings where one seems to burn out twice as fast as the other for no clear reason, you can take comfort in the usual explanations. Genetics, chance, lifestyle. All of those are real enough, and they fill most of the story. But if, in some quiet moment, you feel a passing doubt, if you stand in front of a mirror late at night and think, just for a heartbeat, that the person looking back has seen a different share of days than you remember living, you will know why I hesitated before filing this under fiction, even though I know that is what I'm supposed to do. Because the official evaluation is technically correct. Project Mirror Twins did not give them a practical method to control aging. It did something more ambiguous. It suggested, in the dry, smudged ink of its surviving pages, that whenever two lives become tightly connected, time itself may start keeping their accounts together. And if that is true, then somewhere, in a forgotten lab or a misplaced box of papers, there may still be other attempts to redraw those accounts, waiting for someone tired enough or curious enough to open them.